Boo to the zoo, everyone. This is Ty Defoe of the Anishinaabe and Oneida Nations, joined this evening with Ahimsa and a special guest, Beverly Little Thunder from the American Indian Community House in our Two Spirit and Indigiqueer series with elders bestowing wisdom, anecdotes, and just talking about life. We are grateful to have you join us. And just first of all, want to thank all the people behind the scenes and organizers that are making this happen, both seen and not seen, bringing us together in this circle this evening. So, miigwech and aho,
Mm.
ahimsa.
Yawatai and Sego, everyone. It's really lovely to be here. And thank you, Tanis, for behind the scenes help, and Yagawihene for all your support as well. This is our Sacred Spaces series, our Elder series, where we gather and get to bask in the wonder that is these beautiful elders who have powerful stories from their journeys to share and different life lessons. And tonight we're honored to have a fabulous two-spirit elder, Beverly Little Thunder. So I'm going to be reading Beverly's bio, and then we're going to have Beverly present. And then at the end, there'll be a dialogue between AICH and Beverly, and we're going to be opening it up to the audiences watching. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to share those via Facebook, and then we'll definitely try and weave those in later during the Q&A. Beverly Little Thunder is a member of the Standing Rock Lakota Nation, a great-grandmother and grandmother to many. She is a two-spirit woman who has spent most of her 73 years guiding ceremony for others like herself, who have been disenfranchised because of who they love. Author of the memoir One Bead at a Time, she has been a speaker at numerous universities, conferences, and community events. Living in Vermont, she is dedicated to teaching by example the ways we can care for the distressed Mother Earth we depend upon. She believes our differences can unite us all if we allow ourselves to show love and compassion for each other instead of judgment and criticism. Hope you'll all join me in giving a very, very, very warm welcome to Beverly Little Thunder. Thank you, Beverly, for being here, and we're really excited to have you. Yawa.
Mm. Tehane. I'm so grateful to be here tonight. It is an amazing, amazing technology that has been laid before us. And with it comes a lot of responsibility. I want to start tonight by talking about what two-spirit means. Many people are confused about the terminology two-spirit. And it first originated from a group of people who came down from Canada and introduced it to us. And a couple of years later, we were going to put together a book called Two Spirit People. And we were all from different nations, and we had addressed a council meeting of anthropologists in DC. And we asked them to use a term that was ours, not one that anthropologists gave to us. At that time, they were using terms like winkte, which is a Lakota term for a gay man. They were using the word bradash, which isn't even a native word. It's a comes from a Persian root that means boy prostitute. So that kind of left me out. So we talked about, what term can we come up with to use so that when someone is writing about a room full of Native people, they don't have to spend 3 pages writing down what each tribe had called them, because all of our tribes had a name for us. And we remembered that term, two-spirit. And all of us discussed that in all of our languages, it meant that we were like between the male and female, and that we kind of had that balance. And so we felt that two-spirit was appropriate. Now, this has been 30 years ago. And we also recognized at that time that the next generations might not like the term. Even some people in that generation might not like the term and might prefer to be called lesbian or gay. But for writing purposes and for anthropologists, it worked. We have had different conversations through the years. At Standing Rock, we had a large influx of non-native gay and lesbian people come to the Two-Spirit camp. We had a good-sized camp there. And they would say, well, I'm Two-Spirit. And we sat in a circle and talked about that. And we all agreed that the term Two-Spirit should only be used by someone of Native American descent or who is Indigenous First Nations. And that's what we asked. It was, so much has been taken from our people, and this was something that we wanted to keep for ourselves. And so at least with the, 20 or 30 people that were there, that was the decision that was made. There's a lot of young people on our reservations who have been committing suicide. There's a lot of young Two-Spirit people on the reservations. And I think in 30 years since I came out, a lot has changed. No one would admit that they were a Two-Spirit person 35 years ago. It just wasn't something you would do. And today, the young people are being able to identify and finding that there are some people that accept them, but there are also some people that don't. And the violence that they endure sometimes drives them to the point of suicide. We do have people who are working. There are two women on the Pine Ridge Reservation who have been going around to the tribal councils and getting them to pass ordinances that prevent violence against Two-Spirit people, that endorse Two-Spirit marriages. And they've been working on that for a couple of years. And they do a lot of good work in our community. And they're young women. And I think that for young people coming out today, there are so many more resources, so much more support, that all you have to do is ask for it, and it will be there. And with the technology that we have, it's much easier to connect with someone. It's almost like sitting in the living room with them. So for young people who are wanting to come out, but who are afraid to, take advantage of technology and reach out that way, because that can be a safer way to talk with someone about who you are and how you feel. My daughter, who is 45, was one that used to go around and take all my books, and if they had the word gay or lesbian, she would turn them around so you couldn't see the titles when her friends came over. And she even came to me when she was 17 and said, "Mom, I have something to tell you." And I says, "Well, my girl, what is it?" She said, "Now, don't get upset, but I think I'm straight." I didn't expect that. And I looked at her and I said, "Well," I said, "you might fall in love with 50 men in your lifetime, You might fall in love with 50 women in your lifetime. And then you might fall in love with 50 Martians in your lifetime. But I want you to know that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to me as long as you are happy. And she looked at me for a long time and then said, oh, okay. Then about 3 weeks later, she came home from school and says, Mom, she says, I started a club. I said, you did? And she said, yeah. And the principal said that, you know, we could have space for it. And I said, well, what kind of club? And she says, it's a gay and lesbian support group. I said, okay. And a few years later, she found a partner and they were together for 20 years. So, you know, it can be difficult. And you can feel that you're a two-spirit person and still marry someone of the opposite sex. I did. I married 3 different men. I tried really hard to be straight because in my time, if you got married and had children, it was a good thing. And so I got married and couldn't tolerate it. So I get a divorce. I got married again. And a third time, it was like, you know, I don't know about this. And by this time, I had 5 children. And I thought, if I keep going on this way, I'm going to have 10 children, and I don't want 10 children. So that's when I came out. And it was in 1976. And when I think back to it, it was really scary. And no doubt for young people today, it's really scary. But there is a place for you. There's a place for us all in the circle. If one person steps out of the circle, it changes the energy of that circle. So every single person in that circle is valuable. Every single person has a gift. Even when you don't think you have a gift, you have a gift to give to the community. So I want you to think about that when you think about coming out and start feeling like, well, this is too hard. I am an enrolled member of Standing Rock Reservation. And when the peaceful protest against the pipelines was happening, I did go there. And there was actually a ceremony that was held to welcome the Two-Spirit camp. And because when I had left ceremony back in 1985, I was told women like me were shot. I was kind of nervous going back, but it was the complete opposite. And as all these people, about 300, came and shook our hands and welcomed us and thanked us for being there, all I could do was cry. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime. So in those 35 years, so much has changed. And that doesn't mean that everybody that was there was accepting. But knowing that there were so many people that were accepting helped make it easier for us. And while Standing Rock was a milestone in the fight for Mother Earth and for our people, we cannot base all of our ideas about who Native people are on that one incident. It was like a stone being thrown into a pond, and there are concentric circles that were created and are still going on today. But to truly understand where passion came from, we have to learn our history. We have to go back to the beginning when the first European put their foot on this ground. We have to understand that the Constitution was not written for us. It was written for rich white landowners. And we were in the way. And even our Black brothers and sisters were held higher than we were. And today you hear a lot about, Black Lives Matter, and I support that 100%, because they're the ones who are being murdered in broad daylight here by some police officers. On the other hand, there are Native people who are being murdered on the reservation by law enforcement. But we don't hear. We don't hear about that. We hear about it between each other. But there's not that impetus to come together like we came together at Standing Rock. And if we really understood how this country was developed and how we got to where we're at today, we would be thinking differently. We would begin to understand that the things that divide us from, say, the Blacks and the Asians, really were a constructed way to keep us where the rich white population wanted us. The difference between us and a lot of people that were brought here or who came here was that this was our home. This is where our ancestors were buried. And it would be like owning a 3-bedroom house and inviting white guests to come in. And then they brought someone else and they took over 1 bedroom. And then they brought someone else and took over the 2nd bedroom. Pretty soon, the Native people would be sitting in the laundry room. And pretty soon, they even pushed us out of the laundry room. And we need to begin to come together amongst all tribes. The division between tribes needs to stop. And Standing Rock, you did see that. But we need to see it every day. We need to instill it in our children. They need to understand the connection between the North and the South. We didn't put those borders there. That was a white construct. We didn't call the natives who lived down south Mexican, South American. We called them by the tribal names. The same for the Native people in the North. But now, so many of our people have been brainwashed to think that there's this big difference. But in reality, we're all sisters and brothers, and we all live on this continent, which is called America. The whole continent is called America. And we just live in the US, the United States. So I'm really, really passionate about learning history. In high school, I hated it. You know, one of those things that comes when you get older. And if I had to tell my younger self something, it would have been, Beverly, pay attention in history. Pay attention in history. But fortunately, I have been able to learn and to understand the system and how it works. And now I tell other people, you need to understand it. You need to read this book or that book or talk to this person or that person, because we have to come together. We have to get on the same page. I think that Standing Rock will go down in history. It will be a part of Native history. But I hope and I pray that it was just a spark that will open up dialogue everywhere, and that perhaps when we can all come together again, we can sit down in a council, in a circle, and talk about how we as Indigenous people in this country can come together. It's communication. Communication is something that was taken from us. We weren't allowed to speak our languages. And when something is said in your language, it's a totally different meaning than what is said in English. And we also need to really relearn that which we lost. Our young people, I see them trying. I see that effort being made. And it makes my heart happy to know that, that is happening. Two-spirit people were once very honored in our tradition. There was a place for us. And when I talked about that circle, well, we were part of that circle. And a family that had a two-spirit person in it was considered very, very blessed. And two-spirit people were honored. They weren't made fun of. If they were a man who felt like they would live as a woman, women took them aside and taught them. Even today, a lot of two-spirit men that I know do some beautiful, beautiful beadwork and sewing, have learned from one in their tribe or their parent or their aunt. And the work they do is just incredible. I think that in the last 35 years, we've stepped back into those sacred roles, but just in a different way. Two-spirit people in my tribe used to take on the orphan children. Life was hard living on the plains, and life expectancy of people was not 100, 110 years old, like, they would have you believe that Native people lived that long. Maybe some did. Maybe some made it to 60, 70. But being 73, I think 73 is pretty young myself. So when a parent died, both parents died, they would step in because maybe their grandparents were very, very old and frail. And so they would step in and take that child and raise that child and teach that child. They would visit with the old people who had relatives who had passed on. You know, maybe a couple had a son and a daughter, and both the son and daughter died. And there was no one there to take care of them when they got old. And so it was usually the two spirit people that stepped in to help those old people. And I see it happening. I see it happening every day around me. And it's quite different than the white model of being gay and lesbian. When I came out back in the 70s, the only place that I could connect with another two-spirit person was at a bar. And I didn't drink. I'd stopped drinking. I'd stopped playing with drugs. I'd started going to the Inipi Sweat Lodge. And it was lonely. It was lonely because I thought if being lesbian means I have to go to the bars and get drunk, that's not me. And at that time, everywhere I went was always meetings were followed by a party. Everybody brought a six-pack to a board meeting, which was kind of odd for me. Today, through those years, a lot of those same people are now following a very spiritual path and who are learning from some of their elders to carry on traditions. They're learning songs. They're learning their language. And so it's quite different for a two-spirit person who comes out today. It might be harder in some respects because they have to make a choice. They have to make a choice how they want to live their life. And if you want to be respected by your people, then you need to give your people respect also. So, you know, in the last 35 years, we have come a long way. You know, the first two-spirit gathering I went to, there were maybe 50 people from Canada and the States. Now today, there must be at least 35 groups across the country and in Canada who get together and have annual gatherings, and they have teachings, and they have times of coming together where they teach each other how to bead, how to do quill work, how to sew, how to do applique work. It's changed a lot. It has grown to the point where I feel like it's the younger generation that, you know, is going to take over. And after all, isn't that what we prayed for? We always prayed that, you know, our next generation would be able to carry on the traditions. The one thing I see that is really a positive in my mind is I was told by elders maybe 10 years ago that this is the time of the women. This is the time for women to step up. And I've watched, and more women are stepping up. There was a time when women were treated pretty much the way the Europeans treated their wives, as property. And there was a lot of domestic violence. And women were kind of relegated to the kitchen, to the house. One intercessor at a Sundance told one of the dancers, don't you know that in Lakota, women are love and men are the law? And she left. She never went back. And I don't blame her. I don't blame her. When you go into places where women are in leadership, it's a real different type of environment. Women bring with them that inherent nurturing and that caring, that compassion, and that love. Not love like when you meet someone and you fall in love with them, but just love. Love for all things. And that when I hear women say, milakayase, all my relations, in honor of all my relatives, they are usually referring to not just the two-leggeds, but the four-leggeds, the creepy crawlies, the fish in the water, and the plant spirits. All of it. All of it is life. And I think that women understand that we were put here to take care of the planet. The planet wasn't put here to take care of us. We don't take care of the earth in the way that we should. And it is very apparent. It's very apparent in the weather and the way the weather is changing, the way crops aren't growing, the way our water is polluted. They talk about organic food. I don't believe there's anything organic. All plants need to be watered. And even if they don't have pesticides or poisons on them to help them grow bigger and better, they have water on them. And unless you go deep, deep, deep into the center of the earth, all water is polluted. All the particles from the tires all across the country that speed down the highway, those particles go in the air. The smoke from factories goes in the air. All these toxic pollutants go in the air. We don't see them, but when the rain comes, what comes down with the water? All these pollutants. And so if it's watering a plant that has been carefully tended and is considered to be organic, you have to think twice about it. And the cause of that is us. We're all responsible. And as Native people, sometimes it seems like we're talking to a stone wall. But more and more I see some of the young non-Native people finally getting it. And sometimes I wonder if it's going to be too late. And if there's anything that weighs heavily on my shoulders, it's that fear for the generations that are coming. What will they be born into? What will be here for them? We're taught to think about 7 generations ahead before us and 7 generations after us. As women, Two-Spirit people, trans people, anyone who is gender non-conforming, we have a place where our voices can be heard. And everywhere I go across the country, some of the movements towards changing the way that people think are led by Two-Spirit people. And more, I hear about people who are so judgmental, so judgmental. When we first began identifying as lesbian or gay, Arch Spirit, we were struggling to be acknowledged, to be recognized. And we have trans people in our communities who are male to female, female to male. And yet there are people who judge them and say, well, you're not really a woman. You're not really a man. And they say some pretty vulgar things sometimes. And as an elder, I feel like I need to say to them, you are doing the same thing that colonialism has taught people to do. And that's to put yourself in the role of judge for someone. Who are you to say this person is not a woman? She has identified herself to me as a woman. She is a woman to me. This man has identified himself to me as a man. I don't have to look under their skirts. That doesn't matter. That's not what makes them who they are. And so I would hope that that kind of hatred would stop, that we might recognize that none of us have a clause in our life contract that says we get to be judged. We get to judge someone. And it's hard. It's hard because colonialism has imprinted on all of us. We were all born into colonialism. Everything we do has been colored by colonialism. And we're trying to step away from that. We're trying to tease out what our values are versus what colonialism tells us that values should be. Not an easy job. And the young people are starting to listen and hear. You know, most people listen so that they can develop a response or a reply. Very few people listen to understand what another person is saying. And that simple little change in thinking can make a big difference. And our people need to get back to what we once knew. We're never going to get back to what our ancestors did 200 years ago. I don't know anybody who's 200 years old that I can ask. But we can be the very best people that we can be while we're here. And I think that sometimes we forget that we were once judged, and we were once put in a position to be defensive. You know, here in Vermont, it's very interesting because the tribes in Vermont have just now been recognized by the state. And there's 4 bands that I'm aware of. They're small bands. And a lot of them, if you were to see them, you would think that they were Caucasian. And when you go across the country, you meet a lot of Native people who look like they could be Caucasian. The one thing I have learned is that we don't get to decide who our children fall in love with. We don't get to decide who our children decide to mate with. And I think that's important to think about, because when you look around, there are very few full-blooded natives in any tribe. And a lot of that's because of how colonialism set it up. Reservations set it up that way. Blood quantum. How much blood are you? Oh, you don't have enough, you can't be Indian. Oh, you're not Indigenous. You're not Native American. You have blue eyes. That does not determine who you are. That does not determine your connection to your people. In the Lakota tribe, if a Navajo married a Lakota woman and they had a child, they would have to choose which tribe that child was going to be enrolled in. And then they would only be enrolled as half Navajo or half Lakota. So that when those children married and had children, it would drop it down to a quarter. And so on and so on. So pretty soon, wouldn't even be recognized. And it's a process of elimination, of genocide, that we need to stop. We need to embrace everybody who identifies as our sisters or our brothers. Because we're living in a system that would like to see us disappear so that they didn't have to deal with the skeletons in their closet and all of the treaties that were not honored. It's something that bothers me a lot when I hear that. I was once in the Indian Health Hospital in Phoenix, and I was waiting. I had an appointment, and a woman walked in, traditional Navajo, long skirt and the velvet top, and her hair back in a bun, beautiful. She was an older woman. And of course, I was much younger then too. And behind her this young man walked. And he was very tall, and he was dressed in basketball shorts and socks and tennis shoes. And he had hair that was well past his waist, had it in a long braid, and it was carrot red. And his skin was just as white, and he had freckles. He had blue eyes. And he sat down and he postured like many Navajo men I have seen. And then he and his grandmother started talking. And he spoke fluent Navajo. And the thought that went through my head was this young man is going to have some difficulty as he goes through life. But at the same time, I felt so honored to be able to witness that, because it came at a time when I was really questioning, how to determine if someone's Native or not. And I realized that, we're not all cut out of cookie cutters. We all look different, but our hearts pretty much are the same. I think that as I get older, I developed a whole different way of looking at the world. And in my 20s, I was very passionate and standing right out there in the middle of, any fray that happened, any protest, I was there. I was a part of AIM in Los Angeles. And then I moved into my 30s, and I became a little more selective about what I was going to fight for. And in my 40s, I really sort of started taking a hard look. And in my 50s, I was pretty sure that I knew what was important to me. And then in my 60s, I started thinking about, what can I do? What can I leave for those coming after me? And in the Native culture at one time, when you got older, you were respected. And people came to you and talked to you. As a woman, you weren't expected to stand in the kitchen all day. The younger women did that. And now, as I'm getting older, I find that I'm having to teach people how to respect their elders. I mean, there are definitely elders and there are old folks. And an elder is someone who has had life experiences that can help a younger person guide them. And they're willing to do that. And they're willing to do it without judgment, with compassion, with love. And I no longer have to be in the front. Last year, I went on a march, and it was for the environment. And we carried a tree, we carried some water, we carried a candle, we carried a staff, and we walked 65 miles over a period of 5 days. Each morning, they would call me and ask me to stand in the front. the march off. And that was really nice for about the first mile. By the time we got to mile 2, I was halfway back in the group. And by the time I got to mile 3, I was in the tail end. And I usually finish the day at the very end of the march. But I was so glad that I was able to make it. I was very proud of myself. The 65 miles is a long way to walk. I feel that when there's elders in a group, they're the ones I want to go first to feed themselves, them, and then mothers with children. And because that is what I have taught the people that surround me, that is what they do. But, you know, I've always said, be careful what you ask for, be careful what you pray for. Well, oftentimes they'll say, you know, okay, our elders go first. And everybody turns around and looks at me. And I realize I'm the oldest one in the room. And I'm like, ooh. You know, because from here up, I'm 28. From here down, I'm every bit of 73. You know, and I am enjoying, you know, being older. And I feel like my role now is probably more akin to what some of my ancestors did. And that was to support the younger people in what they were doing. You know, I've heard people say, oh, this next generation, they don't know what they're doing. You know, they're doing this all wrong. They're not doing it wrong. They're doing it their way. I see how, you know, tattoos are a big thing. And lots of people have a lot of them. I have some, but not as many as some people I've seen. And some people like to wear gauges in their ears and they get big, big holes. Some like to do piercings here, piercings here. I mean, I don't know how they make it through the metal detector, but I'm sure that when I was their age, there were elders who looked at me and the way I dressed and thought, oh my God, what's she doing? You know, every generation has their way of being. And now that I'm 73, I look at the next generations that are coming and I just smile. Because it's their way of asserting their individuality. And I want them to be individual. I want them to know the path that was laid before them and how that path got there. But I also want them to bring their new ideas to the front. You know, it's, I used to say that I felt like I was mowing a lawn with a lawnmower. And when I die, the lawnmower will stop until someone comes, a younger person, and picks it up and continues mowing in that way, making a path for those who come after. In many, many ways, I see the division between urban and reservation people coming together. Again, we have to remember that that was the colonial construct that separated us, that sent so many of our people to the cities, that tried to indoctrinate them and assimilate them. And then there are those that have stayed on the reservation and endured incredible hardships to stay alive. But we need to take that wall down. We need to recognize that we all have things to teach each other. and that neither is better than the other. That we're all people, we're all indigenous people. We're all connected to the earth. We're connected to each other. We're connected to all living things. And I remember that if all the plants and animals on this planet died, as human beings, we would really suffer. We'd have no food. Our air would be unbreathable. It's only for the trees that we have air to breathe. But if all the human beings were to suddenly die, what's going to happen to the earth? She's not going to die. She's going to flourish. Things will come back that hadn't been there for a long time. I think about the dinosaurs. I love dinosaurs. But I think about how a catastrophe ended their lives. And life as they knew it ended. But from that evolved new life. And the earth began to flourish again. And now we're at a point where we have destroyed it. So it's important for us to think about those things. And during this time of this COVID isolation, I urge everybody to grow your own food. Even if it's a squash plant, a tomato plant. If you live in the city, you have a windowsill. Grow something, get a seed and grow it. Because there's going to come a time before too long that you're going to be dependent on the food that you grow. And stop judging each other. Because we are now in a time when we are dependent on each other. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Beverly. Nyawa, that was just so lovely. I think we'll be gathering together with Ty and having a lovely dialogue, your presentation. Thank you for sharing so richly and beautifully. And I think we'll soon be going to, maybe we already are on gallery view. Okay, yeah. So I think Ty will be coming back in a second. Wow, this was really lovely. And I know that there's also been some different questions and comments from Facebook. So if either like Ty or Tanis would maybe want to share some of those, that would be great. So yeah,
Sure.
this was just so rich. You spoke from so many beautiful different places, and it's a real honor. And I was also thinking about the wonderful presentation from Pete Hill a few weeks ago. It was really wonderful to hear him speak in such powerful ways. And when we were thinking about who to invite to be part of the Elder Series, you both like sprung ahead as people that are like, oh, they're amazing. It would be wonderful to gather together with them. And since we're also recording this, this will become part of AICH's archives so that people who couldn't make it here today live will be able to experience it on Instagram and YouTube in the coming weeks, and also just, for the future generations. I'm just gonna check.
That's such an honor. It's an honor.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. So yeah, let me just check. Tana says that she's letting people know on Facebook if they have any questions to type them in the comments. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm just scrolling through. I think Ty's having some computer problems at the moment, so hopefully he'll be back
Yeah, I
shortly.
know he
But
had some Wi-Fi issues earlier,
yeah,
so yeah.
there's a lot of comments. People were very engaged. There's lots of people on still watching.
Yeah.
Diana Williston says, I live in Southeast Oklahoma, and LGBTQ to us IA plus people still face ostracism by their own families and communities when they come out. We could use more affirming voices like Beverly's.
Mm.
Just a nice comment. Um, that this is so interesting. Oh, and
Thanks for sharing these, Tanis. I appreciate it.
sure. And every time I'm scrolling, and every time someone comments, I get bumped again, but because people are still commenting.
That's great.
Blessed
That's
for
great.
your compassion and wisdom. Yeah, people have just been following along. Love this, gave me peace. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your inspiring words and wisdom, so important for all people to understand.
Mm.
Yeah, just a lot of loving comments.
In Oklahoma, in northeast Oklahoma, there are a group of two-spirit men and women, and one of the uh, organizers he knows Cherokee language, and he teaches the Cherokee language.
Mhm.
And it's always lovely to see because they have a drum and they travel places with this two-spirit drum. And the whole family comes. So, you know, there are pockets of people that, you know, are good resources. Excuse me.
No, there's lots. I live here in Tulsa, and it's been here now for a year and a half, and um, yeah, like there's just really amazing people doing work here, just period, in terms of Native country, and also in terms of two-spirit organizing. And I'm still just getting a sense of things in some ways. And
Do you know
yeah, but
Wade
we've
Belvins?
not personally, but I've heard really beautiful. I was actually thinking if you're talking about Wade, I've never
Huh?
met Wade, to my knowledge, unless it was some larger national gathering, and I just didn't realize I met Wade. But I was wondering if it was Wade that you're talking because I've heard about Wade, and yeah, that's wonderful. Right on, right on. Yeah, we had Sage Chanel host one of our
Hmm?
two-spirit bingos earlier
Uh,
this summer. We also had Landa Lakes host
uh-huh.
one of our two-spirit bingos. And so we've definitely some Oklahoma, either still based
Right.
people or people from
Mm-hmm.
Oklahoma are now living in the Bay Area, such as
Right.
Landa and stuff. And one of the hopes that while I'm here is to increasingly build those connections between Oklahoma folk who are still here, as well as those in diaspora. Like, I don't know if you know my friend Glenda Dillingham, who's a two-spirit Chickasaw therapist down
No.
in the Southwest, and
Uh,
and who also knows Landa, and I've known her since last century, since last millennium. And so one of the things I feel like one of my responsibilities here is, in addition to like amplifying local Native voices here in Oklahoma, is also those diasporic voices. So those voices can come home, even if it's
right.
digitally via, you know, platforms like this,
Right.
or other things, because one of the things we can do, like there's 39 federally recognized tribes within the state. And
Yeah.
here in Tulsa, like, you know, we're in a tri-tribal Muskogee, Cherokee, Osage territory. So as much as we can, like, to center those voices, and then to bring those voices from these regions back. Like I hope that's how, like, the people, wherever they go, their protocol is to center those local Native voices.
Right.
And yeah, yeah. So let me
Someone
just
asked,
go
I've
ahead.
just been,
somebody asked a question about immigrants.
yeah, oh great, you're
Uh,
seeing that. I'm just gonna copy and
yeah, I
paste them
saw
in
that.
here so you can keep up with them.
Okay, you can see the chat. Great. Yeah,
Okay.
that's actually from my friend Parajat in New York. So yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you know, uh, immigrants who come and who are part of the indigenous, you know, community where they have come from should be welcomed and they should be embraced. Because as I said earlier, we did not put up that border. You know, there were some tribes that were right on the border when the fighting broke out, and some of them fled south to be with family, and some of them came north to be with family. Then all of a sudden, there's a border. And so if you're on this side of the border, you can identify as, you know, as a native in a native tribe. But on that side of the border, well, now you're Mexican. I mean, you know, it's the traditions are different, granted. They've learned different traditions because they lived in that environment. But they're just as rich and as sacred as our, you know, our beliefs and traditions are. And we have much more in common than we have differences. Much more. And I think that the women recognize that more so than the men. Because there are, you know, contingents of women who go south and who, you know, who in some cases have sheltered immigrants from ICE. So they need safe places to go in this environment that we live in right now. Here in Vermont, a migrant workers, migrant justice, and we're constantly fighting, trying to get better working conditions for the dairy workers, trying to get the police to stop, oh, what's the word? I can't remember the word I'm thinking of, but profiling. You know, people that they stop. They certainly stop more brown people than they do, brown and black people than they do white people. My partner has a used Mercedes, and she was driving it back and forth to town, and she told me that one of her taillights was out, and she bought the bulbs, and I had to go somewhere, and so I took the car, and the bulbs were sitting on the little console between us. She hadn't put them in. Now, she'd been driving all week. I was not even 2 miles from home, and I got pulled over. And I, you know, I just had a laugh. You know, he let me go with just a warning because I showed him the bulbs. And, but I know that it was because this is a brown woman driving a Mercedes. And I told my partner, I said, you know, if you'd been driving, you wouldn't have been stopped.
Blessings. True. Yeah. I see from some of the other comments, so that earlier question about immigrants is from a South Asian sister in New York who I knew through movement and dance circles. And I know that she was definitely interested in terms of what you were sharing about, I think, in terms of immigrants or other people of color living in solidarity vis-a-vis Native struggles. And then I don't know if you know from the DC area, who used to live in the Bay Area, Valerie Papaya Man, another friend of mine, African descent queer sister. And she said, thank you, Himsa, for inviting me to attend this event and hear this wisdom from such a beautiful soul. We met each other back last century as well, doing HIV prevention education work in Oakland and the larger Bay. And yeah, so various people have been tuning.
That's another whole dialogue.
Let's go
there are so many Black people who are Native descent. And again, it's learning your history and understanding what happened in the South. And, you know, I mean, there was a whole town in Florida that was Black and Native. And they, you know, they got wiped out. They got wiped out. And it's in the history books. It's all in history. I wish I'd paid more attention when I was in high school. Now I'm having to learn it all over. And it takes time. It does take time.
No, I think one of your things you were talking about in terms of red Black folk, in terms of African Native American folk, and other things is like the phenotypic stuff that you were talking about before, like, you know, in terms of whether it's like Abenaki communities in Vermont or like a lot of our Eastern Seaboard communities from at least like up through Massachusetts down through the Caribbean, the majority along the waterways at least are going to be at least triracial, like of Native
Right.
and African and European descent, you know? So for example, when a friend of mine years ago was in New York and she was moved from a different part of the country and she was wondering, she was Chiricahua Apache, and she asked me like, so am I seeing local Native people when I'm in different spaces in New York? You know, are these local tribal communities or are these more diasporic folk? And immediately without thinking, because I'm from New York, I was like, well, are you seeing Black folk? And she was like, what? And I said, are you seeing folk who, in your mind, among their different bloodlines, are at least perhaps partially of African descent? And she thought about it for a second. She's like, well, in this space, yes, and that space, no. And I said, well, if you're not seeing at least some people of African descent, to whatever degree that's visible, you know, in their physical appearance, then you're not seeing a huge amount of our tribal communities from the Northeast going down to the Southeast, you know, because so much of the histories of mixing here are histories of Native and African peoples, as well as Europeans and other communities mixing. And
Right.
what looks Native in different parts of the country will be very different based on those different histories because of either mixing such as that, or mixing with just maybe many more centuries of French people in the Northeast becoming very pale looking, you know, very, in other people's mind, very white looking. Or in the Southwest, because people are from the region of people who may have become, you know, more mestiza or mestizo or mestizex identified, might look Mexican in someone's mind because they're from the same region that became, you know, through colonization part of Mexico, and then with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the colonization of that with the US, or in the Northwest or like the Pacific, like in Hawaii, people might assume that those Native folk, like Native Hawaiians, look Asian because there's a history of mixing with Asians. But it's really sort of going beyond this more racist limited notion of what Native looks like, that there's one stereotypical kind of, you know, way of looking Native.
Well, it comes down to privilege. You know, we talk about white privilege, and we rarely look at ourselves and talk about the privilege that we have. And like I often say to people, I have privilege because when someone looks at me, they almost immediately know I'm Native. But I have 3 granddaughters who their father was Maidu and something else. My daughter is Lakota. And my granddaughters are very fair and very light. And if you saw them, you wouldn't know they were Native. But they actually have more Native blood in them than their mother. You know, and the oldest granddaughter is her boyfriend is Navajo and Lakota. So if they have children, they're actually going to have more Native blood than myself and, you know, all of the family put together. But we have to learn to look beyond what we see right in front of us. We need to look into the hearts of those people. And that's something we have forgotten to do. We've forgotten how to. And like I said, I don't get to be judge of anybody.
I was wondering if you could speak a bit more, and if there are additional questions or comments, feel free to share them with us, Tanis or Ty. And I'm checking my phone occasionally because I know Ty's had Wi-Fi, so in case Ty texts me or something. And you also, we gave you a bunch of questions, like over a dozen, and it was really beautiful to see you weave them in as we were talking. So I kept on, you know, I looked at the list and I was like, oh, she talked about that. So, you know, you have existed in multiple geographies over time and been a part of multiple intersecting movements. And I was wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about your sort of experiences in terms of like larger, maybe like women of color movements, that have existed for going back many decades, like, because I'm thinking about just different people who I love and I've been blessed to know, such as Barbara Smith, who's up in like the Albany
Yeah.
area, Sherry Moraga back in the day, Merle Wu, Aurora
Yeah.
Levins Morales. There are so many legendary sisters, many of whom were Beth Brandt, who I didn't get to meet but was in correspondence with. May she rest in peace. Christos, who I got to know when I lived in the Bay Area when she'd come down from Seattle. And
Barbara Cameron.
Yeah, Nation Shield, yep. And so yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about maybe both, like other different like two-spirit Native women or gender diverse folk and or sort of Native women's or your particular participation in sort of these larger pan women of color dialogues, because I think oftentimes, like when I've talked with Barbara Smith, a lot of people know her in terms of maybe say African-American activist, literary or critical traditions. And even though she was definitely a huge part of the founding and maintenance of, you know, Kitchen Table Press and so much of what we've inherited as queer trans people of color in our movements, I don't know if they are always thinking about the pan women of color context, that these sisters were in conversation and building and or loving like so many different people, and it informed their analysis, their activism, their teaching, their art making. So yeah, any way that you might want to respond to that, that would be amazing.
Well, you know, it all of the women that that you're talking about, and there are many women that I know that we all live in, we're all spread out, and most of us are so busy doing work in the region that we live in that we rarely get a chance to come together. We barely get a chance to come together and to talk about what each other is doing, what common goals that we have, what obstacles that we encounter. And I think that sometimes, I know that I can't speak for, all my sisters, but I know that sometimes I feel really alone. And the one thing that we still encounter is that pushback. We still encounter that, the hateful comments, the degrading comments, the things that try to tear us down. And I know that I've had to develop a thick shell to let those things bounce off and realize that, I can't take them personal. Most of the time they're coming from people I don't even know, and they don't know me. And so as all of these sisters are doing work in the areas that they are, we're all working towards a common goal, and we're all working for our people and for the next generations. And you see it in writings, you hear it in some of Christos's poems. Yeah, I mean, look at Muriel Miguel, what she and her sisters have done. They're tremendous work that they have, lifelong work they have done through their plays and their acting. Muriel and her partner just got married not too long ago. But while I love Muriel dearly, I only got to see her briefly at March last year. And as we parted, I thought, is this going to be the last time I see her in person? We're all getting, all the sisters you mentioned are not youngsters. And there's a whole new generation that's coming up whose names we don't know. And I think that each of us is probably beginning to think about how little time we have left and what we want to do with that time. I think My daughter swears I'm going to be here another 50 years. Well, that'll take me to well over 100, and I don't think I want to do that. But it's important for me to make each day count. It's important for me to make each time that I speak count. And I'm only guessing that that's how, like Sherry Moraga, Christos, Muriel, how they felt. You know, and I know Barbara Cameron will always be very special to me. She was the first Lakota lesbian I met when I came out. And I have a whole story where I actually, she thought I was stalking her because I wanted to meet her. I saw a picture in a book and read an article in the book. And I have to meet this woman. And I asked some women who had come down from the Bay Area if they knew her, and just by chance they did. And so I asked them to give her a note, and I sent my phone number. I didn't hear from her for a long time, and one day the phone rang very tentatively. This is Beverly, Little Thunder. I said, yes, yes. I got excited. She was very quiet. And she even said, you know, I thought this woman was like stalking me. We became very good friends. But, you know, she's gone. She's not here anymore. And when I heard that Beth had passed, I was just, you know, heartbroken. And we're going to hear more and more people passing because we're at that age. You know?
Blessings. Yeah, one of the things, like, I wish I had this beautiful magic two-spirit wand that I could like just like sprinkle funding dust over certain things, because I'm like,
right.
Oh my goodness, like Christos, I mean, like her work, and I know she's still continuing that work in so many different spheres. But like when I was reading like Not Vanishing, Dream On, and Her I Am, Fugitive Colors, Firepower, I can like just from memory like name those like you know 5 books, you know, or whenever like just different people would be coming out things. Like I also was blessed to know like Jewel Gomez when I lived in the Bay Area, and I've been able to keep in touch and see new plays of hers in New York City when she's come out, and for me, like I just felt really blessed to come up in many ways from childhood, like in these communities of elders, you know, in a very pan like women of color, and occasionally like trans male elder of color, like Maxwell Valerio, who is also one of the contributors to Bridge Call My Back kind of context. And yeah, and like I've just wanted to be like, oh my goodness, like what I feel is like, you know, especially with like so many things that happened in the 90s into 2000s into the 2010s, like, you know, our bookstores closed down, you know, a lot of our presses closed down. Like a lot of new folk have come out with like, for example, in terms of writers, like with books or other projects, but I feel like so many of the elders who really created spaces for us in so many ways either got pushed out of a lot of their gender studies, women's studies, ethnic studies kind of positions, if they were teaching, or became either unemployed or underemployed or had to find other ways of economically surviving. And for me, like when I look at the legacies of radical women of color who've been building in powerful ways in so many ways, definitely straight women of color have struggled in so many ways and continue to do so as elders. And also I feel like in terms of, you know, queer, lesbian, bisexual, two-spirit, and trans women of color elders, I just feel like I'm not even sure if people are aware of how precarious the lives of so many of our sisters have been in their later years. And I feel like we should be mobilizing, we should be having elder series for like to help them get their dance projects out or books out, or we still should have an endowed chair at a university doing whatever she wants to do, you know, and just feeling like people who are doing native press series or other things, like we need to really be coming together around our elders and to
Right.
be really saying like, well, what do you want? And,
Right.
you know, what would you like to see in your many years? How can we support that? And so I guess that would be a question I'd like to ask you is, if you also had a magic two-spirit wand that could sprinkle funding dust over the land, like what, if you had an opportunity to gather with a lot of some of these Native queer elders, queer women of color elders, or other folk that you feel you've been in dialogue with and or that you would love to see, not just one last time, but multiple times,
Right.
what would you like to see, or what would the shape of that be, so that we can at least maybe dreamscape that, you know,
I
and
think
try and
that
build towards it?
it would be all of these people we're talking about. It would be funded so that they could travel to be in one place for a week.
Mhm.
And we would have talking circles in which we talked about what we were doing. Each one would have a theme so that we were able to hear each other and to share.
Mm.
To have younger people have a circle behind us
Mm.
so they could hear.
Mm.
They could hear what we were saying
Mm.
and hopefully carry that out to another circle one day. But then we would have a talking circle in which they would ask questions
Mm.
and we would be able to answer some of those questions. And maybe even a week wouldn't be long enough, you know, but we'd have to have it in a space where we were comfortable, that was accessible. You know, all of those things. So my magic wand would have to have a lot of funding dust.
Rather than the key to
You
the
know,
city, I
because
wish to be able to present that to you.
yes.
Wow.
So, you know, and who knows, it may happen. Right now, in COVID times, it's not. The only way we can do it is by Zoom. But, you know, wouldn't that be wonderful to even have a Zoom conference, inviting some of these people to come? It's a good idea.
Maybe we can make that happen.
Maybe we can.
Ashe, beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful. Hey, Tanis, are there any additional comments? I saw that there was one from someone from Parajat who had spoken earlier. Thank you for your responses, and Ahimsa for your fantastic facilitation. Oh, that's very nice. I wasn't trying to read that together. Humble brag, I hadn't read it yet. And then the one above that from Tracy Hamilton said, thank you for addressing the colorism. It's unfortunate, so pervasive in so many groups. Yeah,
even within communities, you know, the lateral violence that happens really, it's, you know, it's a colonial tool that we seem to have embraced, and the lateral violence that we perpetuate on each other holds us back more than anything, because it's builds those walls, and we need to be taking those walls down rather than building them.
So I'm seeing that those are the comments for right now. And then I just have one last question for you, which is, and deep gratitude to you, is whether we engage the answers to them tonight or not, what are questions that are never asked of you that you've been wanting to be asked? Like, or if there were topics that, you know, I wish some point at someday I could speak on this because that's an interest of mine or a commitment of mine or a part of my life journey that has been important for me. Like, for example, when we were talking a few weeks ago, you had shared about being in Arizona at the time. So I don't know if there's ever been a recorded dialogue with you about different geographic periods of your life and maybe lessons from those times or experiences or insights, or when we were talking to Pete Hill or other people is, well, where were you during this historical period? Or what is
Right.
your experience of this moment? Like, so for example, Standing Rock,
Mm-hmm.
mobilizations in terms of No Dapple, and situating that in a larger context. So yeah, are there questions or topic areas, whether for tonight or in the future, that
I think
this
one
is
of
an important part of who
the
you are that you'd like to engage
yeah,
more?
one of the questions that, you know, I never get asked and I don't address is what was it really like being a part of the early movement? What did I really experience? Um, People have romanticized so many periods of movement, like Alcatraz. That was not a fun place to be. That was not a coming together of people. Like, they didn't build a community like they did in Standing Rock. It was chaotic. It was just a bunch of people coming together without understanding why they were there.
Mhm.
No one ever wants to hear, you know, the flip side of what we came together for.
Mhm.
And I sat around the table the other night and we had some guests, and my granddaughter started the conversation. And I sort of kind of dabbled in it, and she just kept asking these real direct questions. And it was hard. It was really hard. But that's something that, you know, I don't hear too often, even
Mhm.
from others.
Mhm.
You know, the hard part of being a part of the movement.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's not all fun and games.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and also because you want to talk lovingly about the movements and your communities and not have anything that you say be used against the movements, but you also have the right to have that internal critique, you know,
Right,
and to really want to critique it to build on the best and not erase those
right.
intersectional challenges. Like, you know, whether, like, it reminds me of like Aisha Shashida Simmons' work, Know the Rape documentary, and her work looking at rape within Black women survivors of rape, and really looking at rape within the Black community. And just, you know, as, you know, for her as an African American lesbian feminist filmmaker, exploring these issues and other intersections of violence, like that was such a pivotal documentary for her to make. And the challenges around that, you know, around, can we talk about sexual assault and domestic violence within our civil and human rights social justice movements? You know,
Mhm.
can we talk about, similarly, like same gender domestic violence? Can we be talking about like these issues? Of course we can, and we need to.
Right.
So whether it's misogyny in our movements, queerphobia in our movements, issues of violence, colorism, whatever it might be, like, at least in the movements I came up in, like, one of the things I've always appreciated, sort of like you were saying earlier, like sometimes I think Native women, women of color, like the more intersectional thinking is present, not just in terms of humans, but in terms of all our relations in a variety of ways. And for me, one of the things that I would like to see more straight folk and more men engage is not just the external critique
Hmm.
of the dynamics of institutionalized power, but the ways in which, like, we also have deep internalized stuff to work through, and how we then externalize that against each other.
Right.
Um, so I think having those discussions would be really medicinal and really necessary, and we shouldn't be frightened of them.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I agree. You know, 35 years ago, same-sex domestic violence was something very few people wanted to talk about,
Mhm.
and very few people even understood.
Mhm.
And having been in a domestic violence situation myself with another Native woman, um, and having to leave that was really traumatic. It
Mhm.
was really, really traumatic. And
lessons.
Had nowhere to go, had nowhere to turn to. I couldn't go to a shelter with my daughter because if I said I was lesbian, oh, they didn't want me there. You know, it was like I was going to jump the bones of every woman that was in place, you know. But, you know, now I see that there are groups that are talking about it, and I'm glad. I'm really glad that that's happening. You know, but it's an evolution. It's an evolution. We don't want to talk about the hard stuff. And we don't want to, you know, we don't want to talk about our part in some of the hard stuff. And that because that means that we have to look at how we're behaving and what we did or what we're doing that helps perpetuate that. Sometimes it's like dissecting ourselves, but it needs to be done. It needs to be done.
And it can be done in loving community. Like, that's why I'm grateful for survivors community and other people who are willing to be like, okay, this is where I fucked up, or this is where I'm trying to grow through this, or build a better analysis, or admit how I might have been complicit in enabling this dynamic, or
yeah, it does have to be done in a loving way. And it can be. Can be.
So, sort of beginning to wrap up, one last question tied to that, and then maybe if you have any closing words or remarks you'd like to leave with us. For those people, since we've talked about a variety of topics tonight, including being a survivor, different issues of intersectional oppression, and also various beautiful things, beautiful, you know, magical two-spirit wands, the funding dust over everything. What have been some lessons for you about, well, whether individually or collectively, finding that space within ourselves or building that space with others to break those silences, you know, to be able to speak? Like, there may be people who are watching this who may be in the closet on any level, whether it's in terms of gender, sexual or sexuality, in terms of survivorhood, in terms of coming into their identities as a multiracial person, coming into their power as a woman, you know, like really unlearning the effects of internalized colonization as a Native person. So whatever way that we're flourishing and becoming, how do people sort of emerge from that chrysalis into a butterfly? Like, what are some lessons of not only finding that courage within, or but also how to build more courageous spaces with each other?
I think that the thing that I have learned is that communication, honest communication, is that key that unlocks so many boxes that are closed. And we live in a society that has taught us to be secretive, to hold things in, and to not trust. And you have to trust that what you say is your truth. And that's all you can do, is speak your truth honestly. And how you have no control over who hears it or who receives it, or how they receive it, or what their response is. And for me, that has been the biggest lesson that I have learned, that, you know, I can control no one. I can't change anybody. I can only change how I respond and how I speak. And so honest communication is, and it's hard. It sounds simple, but it's hard. It's hard because we've been taught that, you know, there's going to be someone who judges us. And, you know, when I think about being afraid of what someone's going to think of me, I'm like, well, so what could happen? What could happen? I could lose my job. I might lose friends. My family might not talk to me. All those are fears. And I've learned that the way that I address fear is by recognizing that it's my fear and being honest about, I'm afraid that if I say this, you're going to walk away from me. I'm afraid if I tell you what I'm feeling inside, when you do that, you're never going to talk to me again. And recognizing those fears within ourselves and being able to verbalize them really makes them not so scary anymore. Well, that's what I have learned.
Yawa, Yawangoa.
Mhm.
This has been so beautiful. It's been such a beautiful dialogue. And I just want to thank you for sharing so much with us in so many ways. Are there any final words, or that's also sufficient what you had there? Like,
No, just thank you, Pilamia, for the time and the space and for listening.
Yawangoa.
Mm.
Beautiful. Okay, everyone, many blessings. Thank you for turning in tonight. And please share this with others. And we'll be having Beverly Little Thunder's a video recording of this will be live on our Instagram and YouTube. So please continue to share this with loved ones. And again, Beverly Little Thunder has that lovely memoir that we talked about. And you can definitely find her on the interwebs as well at various conferences and gatherings. So thank you again, Beverly, for being with us. And thank you everyone for joining us. Nyawangwa, Skangwa.